Hi there, how are things? So a few months ago, I recorded an episode inspired by one of my favorite books, The Atomic Habits by James Clear, where I talked about identity and how, becoming a different person often matters more than actually chasing specific results. And today, what I'd like to talk about is another book that had a huge impact on the way I work, on the way I run my business, learn new skills, and generally organize my life in general. So the book is called The One Thing, Jedna Rzecz in Polish. And, if I had to summarize the entire book in just one sentence, that would probably be: extraordinary results are directly determined by how narrow you can actually make your focus. Or, to put it more simply, the fewer things you actually focus on, the more you achieve. The fewer things you focus on, the more you actually achieve. And now I know what you might be thinking. Well, Asha, easier said than done. Because most of us feel exactly the opposite, right? Very often. So we have these endless to-do lists, messages to answer, projects to finish, meetings, emails, courses we want to complete, books we want to read, right? And I guess at the end of the day, we just often feel very busy, but not necessarily productive, right? Sounds familiar? And this book explains why, actually. So today I'd like to share a few ideas that really stayed with me after reading this book. And I've read it a couple of times, by the way, and how I've applied these ideas, these rules to learning new skills, building my business, and even my yoga practice, okay? Okay, so one of my favorite ideas from this book is not everything matters equally. Not everything matters equally, okay? Sounds obvious, right? You could say, but just think about it. Not everything matters equally. Very often we treat all tasks as if they were, of the same importance, equally important, right? Like answering emails, creating a new product, meeting a client, changing, the font on a website, planning some strategy for the next quarter. And, everything ends up on the same to-do list, right? But according to the author of this book, The One Thing, that's one of the biggest mistakes people make. Because many things may be important, but only one thing can be the most important, can be the priority. And I think this is where many people get stuck. I got stuck as well. I've got stuck many times in my life because we spend our days doing things, but not necessarily the right things. And the book says that it is not enough to be busy. It is not enough to be productive. You just need to know where to invest your focus, where to invest your effort and energy. And honestly, I've experienced that many, many times in my own business. So there were periods where I felt incredibly productive, I was working all day, answering messages on Instagram, for example, improving my graphics, editing my websites, creating content, checking statistics of my business. And yet, my business wasn't really moving forward, I would say. Why? Well, I guess because I wasn't just focusing on the thing that would actually drive growth in my business. So, for example, in my case, in my business, it would be creating content, creating products, and then selling my products, right? So those were the things that mattered most. And the rest simply just felt productive, but it wasn't the most important thing. So the entire book actually revolves around one question, obraca się wokół jednego pytania. And to me, it's one of the most powerful questions I've ever come across. I actually have it written down in my notebook and I take a look at it once in a while. And the question sounds as follows. What's the one thing I can do thanks to which everything else will be easier or will just become unnecessary? Let me repeat that, okay? So what's the one thing I can do thanks to which everything else will become easier or will just become unnecessary to be done? Or I guess we could even simplify it and ask, what's the one thing I can do that will bring me closer to my goal? So not 5 things, not 10 things, just one thing. And this question can be applied everywhere, I would say. For example, what's the one thing I can do to improve my English? And many learners immediately create a huge list, right? Grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, listening, speaking, phrasal verbs, business English, right? So everything at once. But what if the biggest bottleneck is actually something else? So maybe mastering English tenses. Because, once English tenses become automatic, then speaking becomes easier, writing becomes easier, building sentences and asking questions becomes easier. And actually, this is exactly the mistake I see among English learners all the time. So people try to improve everything simultaneously at the same time. And then they feel overwhelmed. No wonder, right? But if you actually asked, what's the one thing that would make everything in my English easier? Then very often my answer, if you ask me, would be, just master English tenses. So one thing. Not everything, okay? And there's another idea from the book that I absolutely love, and it's the idea of the domino effect. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but let's dive deeper into that. So when people will first hear about focusing on one thing, they might often ask, okay, but how do I know what my one thing actually is? How to choose this one thing wisely, since there are so many priorities, so many things to be done, so many things that are so important. And this is where the book introduces a very interesting concept. So this domino effect concept. So your one thing shouldn't only, exist on the level of today or on the level of this week. It should actually start with this bigger vision, I would say. So in other words, first, you need to define this long-term, direction or goal, if you want to call it this way. And only then do you identify the one thing you should focus on right away that will be in line with that long-term direction, this long-term goal. Because very often people jump straight into action without even asking themselves where they're actually trying to get, what's the destination, what's the direction, right? So the book suggests working backwards, so to speak. So first you ask yourself, okay, so what's my long-term goal? What's my long-term direction? For example, you can think about learning English now. And then you ask yourself, okay, so what's the one thing I need to achieve this year to move closer to that goal? Let's say you have this 5-year vision, right? So then you're asking yourself, so what's the one thing I need to do this year to move closer to that goal? And once you have that one thing, then again, you keep asking, okay, so what's the one thing I need to do this month to be able to achieve my yearly goal that is in turn in line with my long-term goal, right? And then once you have that, you keep asking more questions. Okay, so what's the one thing I need to do this week to be able to achieve my monthly goal that is in line with my yearly goal? And then, as you can imagine, lastly, what's the one thing I need to do today that will make it possible for me to achieve my weekly goal and then, my monthly goal and then my yearly goal? Okay, so the author compares it to a line of dominoes. That's why it's a domino effect, because one domino knocks over the other one, right? And the next one, and the next one. And this is how it goes. And there is this quote I really like, and I have written it down actually. Planning is bringing the future into the present so that you can do something about it now. Once again, planning is bringing the future into the present moment so that you can do something about it now. And I think that's exactly what effective planning is, right? So not creating these endless to-do lists, but actually translating this long-term direction, long-term vision or goal into today's action. So today is just one thing. And now I'm going to give you an example from my business, for example. So let's say my bigger goal, my vision, my direction is launching a new video course. So for example, this year, or I don't know, this quarter, I'd like to create a new video course. Yeah, English related video course. And now that's not something I can do today, right? And it might even seem to be quite overwhelming. This project, it's going to be quite a big project, right? So I need to break it down. And if I want to launch the course, let's say in 6 months, so then I ask myself, okay, so what needs to happen this month? What needs to happen? What's my one thing this month that will be in line with this big one thing in 6 months, which is releasing a video course? So maybe this one thing for this month is going to be, well, finishing the course outline, conspectus, right? And then I'm going to ask myself, okay, so what's the one thing I need to do this week to be able to actually achieve this monthly goal? And then I can actually say, okay, so my one thing for this week is going to be creating the structure of all modules. And then, as you can guess, I'm going to ask myself, okay, so what's the one thing I need to do today, again, to achieve this weekly goal and then this monthly goal, right? And that could be, for example, well, spending 2 focused hours creating the outline of module 1 from the course. And suddenly this big goal no longer feels so overwhelming, so complex, right? Because I know exactly what matters today. I have my one thing for today. So I'm not really worried about next week, next month, next year, 6 months time, right? Before I actually release the course. All I'm focusing on is today, my one thing for today, and then my one thing for tomorrow, and so on, and so on. And now let me give you another example based on learning English, okay? That might be even more practical for you. So let's apply the same logic to learning English. So let's say your long-term goal is speaking English confidently at work. Very common goal, yeah? So now ask yourself, okay, so what's the one thing I need to achieve this year to move closer to that goal? And maybe then this one thing for this year will be, I finally want to master English tenses, right? And then you ask yourself, okay, so what's the one thing I need to do this month to be able to achieve this yearly goal of mastering English tenses? And then, for example, that could be, okay, so my one thing for this month is going to be completing a tenses course, English tenses course. And then, again, you ask yourself, okay, so what's my one thing for this week? So then you're going to say, okay, my one thing for this week is to finish module 1 from the English tenses courses. And then today, you ask yourself, what's my one thing for today? Well, my one thing for today, based on my weekly one thing, is to watch class 1 and class 2 from module 1. Because my one thing for this week is to complete module 1, so my one thing for today is to watch class number 1 and class number 2 from module 1. Are you with me? Hope it makes sense. Hope you're quite inspired, I hope. So suddenly you're no longer overwhelmed by the huge goal of becoming fluent in English or confident when speaking English at work. You're simply focusing on today's domino, okay? And today's domino creates next week's domino, which creates next month's domino. And eventually it creates the result you're aiming for, right? And yet another idea discussed in the book is the famous 80-20 principle. So in simple terms, a small number of actions often produce the majority of results. A small number of actions most often produce the majority of results. Or maybe we could paraphrase it in this way. So most of what we achieve actually comes from this surprisingly small number of things that we do. And when I actually look back at my own journey with learning English, I can clearly see it. Because people often ask me, okay, Asia, how did you become so fluent and confident speaking English? And honestly, not every activity contributed equally to my fluency and confidence when speaking English. So some things had this enormous impact on my English, and other activities barely, move the needle. So for me, a huge part of my progress came from, for example, speaking regularly. So having this regular speaking practice with a teacher, for example, or maybe in some conversations course. It came from actively revising vocabulary. And that was like, it's a must-have for me. I just did it all the time. So actively revising vocabulary every day. And then, for example, mastering English grammar. I believe that once you tick off English grammar, then you no longer have to get back to that, and it basically pays off. Okay, because you don't have to worry about it anymore. And grammar never changes, obviously. Vocabulary, you can learn it all your life. So I would say these were the three activities that contributed significantly to my fluency in the English language. So it wasn't listening to podcasts all day. It wasn't watching random movies or learning random words. So not every action produces the same result, okay? And that's exactly why we need to identify our one thing, okay? And now let's talk about something we are very often secretly proud of, me too, once in a while, multitasking. So at least what we call multitasking, because according to the book, according to the author, multitasking doesn't really exist. So what actually happens is this constant task switching. And every switch actually comes at a cost, I would say. So the author even mentions some research suggesting that people lose a significant amount of productivity because of these constant interruptions and switching between certain tasks. And I guess I can completely relate to this because there was this period in my business where I would just do everything at the same time. So I would create a course, I would respond to emails, check my Instagram, reply to messages, edit content, give one-to-one classes at the same time. And all that at the same time made me feel that I was incredibly, productive on top of the world. But in reality, I wasn't really finishing anything. So everything was taking longer, right? Because I was doing so much. And I would say I was making more mistakes at the same time. And definitely I was much more stressed because I was constantly on the run, constantly busy, constantly switching between tasks. And I would say the funny thing is that at the end of the day, I felt like really exhausted. So I assumed, because I felt really exhausted, I actually assumed, okay, so I must have been productive today because I'm so tired. But exhaustion is not proof of productivity, according to the book as well. Sometimes it's simply proof of distraction, right? Switching between tasks. So the book describes multitasking as constantly jumping between branches, like a monkey, this monkey mind. You're constantly jumping and switching and not focusing. And I think that's a perfect metaphor. So your attention never gets deep enough to produce this meaningful work. Okay, so another practical idea from the book. So as you can see, a lot of tips. That's why I love getting back to this book once in a while. So another practical idea from the book would be schedule time for your one thing. Schedule time, block your time for your one thing. So don't just hope you will somehow find time for this most important activity. So you need to reserve this time, you need to protect it, you need to, defend it, okay, at all costs. Because if it's not in your calendar, then probably, unfortunately, something else will take its place. And blocking time is actually a technique I've been using for years. And, when I'm working on an important project, let's say releasing a video course, I usually schedule it for the morning. It's my first thing to do. I think I've mentioned it already in one of the episodes, that your willpower is actually strongest in the morning. So before emails, all these messages, meetings, and 1,000 tiny decisions. So the author argues that your most important tasks should be completed when your energy is actually at its highest. Okay? And I guess I couldn't agree more. I suppose you will agree with the author as well. So one more idea from the book that may actually sound a bit uncomfortable is this. Something will always have to wait. Something will always have to wait. So you will always have to sacrifice something or neglect one activity, one maybe area of your life by focusing on your one thing. Because, if everything is important, then nothing is. So the author explains that extraordinary results require these trade-offs. Okay? Extraordinary results require trade-offs. So certain areas of your life may probably temporarily receive less attention while you focus on what matters most right now. Okay? And I think this is an important reminder. I also have it written down because many of us are trying to, build a business, learn a language, exercise daily, read books, spend more time with family, develop new skills, take care of their health, right? All at 100%. And that's simply impossible. For example, if I know that this month I'm launching a new video course, so again, the same example, that probably means that my one thing, will probably revolve around that project. Będzie się kręcić wokół tego projektu. So that means I'm probably gonna work more, I'm probably gonna stay up late, I'm gonna spend less time on other activities, maybe I won't see my friends as often, possibly I won't prepare perfectly healthy meals every day. And that's okay because I know what kind of, season I'm currently in. So another example, as many of you already know, I'm currently 22 weeks pregnant. And obviously my priority now, my one thing now is, my baby and our health. So of course I'm still working on my business, but I do realize that my one thing right now is not maximizing my revenue, is not scaling my business, or even, taking my yoga practice to the next level or shaping my body. That will probably have to wait a little. And honestly, I think a lot of pressure disappears. In my case, a lot of pressure disappeared once I realized that I can't just give 100% to every area of my life at the same time. And perhaps this is the biggest lesson from the entire book. So many things may be important, but only one thing can be the most important. And I guess the challenge is to figure it out, what that thing is right now. And I guess that once my baby is born, I will also have to choose my priorities wisely, and I will have to reduce some activities to the minimum for the time being. And I think what will be extremely useful for me to ask myself every day will be, okay, Asha, so what's the one thing you can do for yourself today to feel nourished, to feel balanced, to feel well taken care of? So what's the one thing you can do for yourself today to just feel good? Or what's the one thing I can do for my business today to just keep it working, or maybe this week to make things work in my business, even though I'm on maternity leave. Because I know that with a little baby on board, it will be impossible for me to do everything like 100%. And one more thing, I guess sometimes I hear from people on Instagram, they have no time to learn English because of, kids, work-related projects, etc. And I guess perhaps sometimes it's worth just reflecting whether learning English is your top priority at the moment. Like, is it the one thing at this very moment for you? Because, if not, if you actually admit it to yourself, like honestly, if it's not your one thing, if it's not the biggest priority at the moment, then it's okay to put it on hold for a while. If you know there are more important things happening in your life at the moment, things which are simply that one thing for you now, then there is nothing wrong in just putting this learning English project on hold, right? But you just have to be honest with yourself, I guess. So if there is one thing I'd like you to remember from today's episode, it's this. Most people don't need to do more. They just need to focus more. Because very often we're not struggling with this lack of effort or this lack of action. We're just struggling with a lot of distraction, with doing many, many things at the same time. And that's a huge difference, I would say. So whenever you feel overwhelmed, whenever your to-do list seems endless, just ask yourself, okay, what's the one thing I can do that will bring me closer to my goal? So not 5 things, not 10, just 1. And then just block this time and protect this time at all costs. So before you move on to the next task, before you check your email, before you scroll Instagram, just ask yourself, what's my one thing this month? What's my one thing this week? What's my one thing today? And whether it's related to English, your business, your health, your finances possibly, or your personal life, just what's the one thing that, once completed will make everything else easier or less important. So just choose it wisely, and just give it your full attention. Because as the book beautifully reminds us, and I actually have it written down as well, extraordinary results are seldom the results of doing many things. They're usually the result of doing the right thing consistently. Okay, so that's it when it comes to my takeaways after reading the book One Thing twice or 3 times, by the way. So it's definitely a book I will be coming back to once in a while to just remind myself of my priorities, of what's important at this very moment in my life. So let me know in the comments whether you found this episode useful and whether you'd like me to record such mindset and productivity related episodes, because I know it's not directly, strictly related to learning English, but I suppose mindset is equally important when basically shaping a new skills. So let me know whether you found it useful, whether you want me to record more episodes like that, and speak to you in a bit. Cheers.